Hey everyone, I'm excited to introduce, and I'm very honored to chat with writer, director, editor Azazel Jacobs. His work includes The Good Times Kid, Mama's Man, The Lovers, Harry, French Exit, and his latest, the highly acclaimed Netflix feature, His Three Daughters. The film premiered in the Toronto International Film Festival in 2023 and was acquired by Netflix this year. Welcome, Azazel. We're excited to hear your experiences working on this film and are very eager to hear your process and how you created this raw and honest, beautiful film about siblinghood, grief, and loss. Before we begin, I'd like to thank and shout out our friends Samantha Fettner and Paula Woods at Paula Woods Consultants for setting up this interview and helping us make this all happen. So thank you so much again. Let's get started. I watched the film, I loved it, and I really kind of resonated with the theme of sort of this the absence, right? There's like a lot of different kinds of themes of how do you approach absence and loss and grief. And I wanted to sort of focus on the editing of that. The editing choices you made in this film sort of quietly assisted that theme of kind of being absent, right? I kind of noticed that we never heard the other side of the phone calls when the sisters were on the phone talking to their families back home. We never saw the father until the end of the film as well. And then sort of the backstories of the sisters itself were all about like not being there for each other when they were needed the most. So if I looked at it from this lens, and I really thought the editing was pretty masterful in that part of it. Was your process in editing this theme of absence in mind? Were you like, was that part of the thought process, or, was this purposeful, or, what was the intention when creating this story?
Well, first off, thanks for having me on. What a great first question to start with, which
Hmm.
really doesn't get talked about much or gets explored. So yeah, this is so I haven't edited my own films for many, many years, and there was a very specific reason that I felt like I needed to edit this one. And it had a lot to do with what you were saying, which was just like I was chasing down a certain kind of pacing, an awkward type of pacing that I felt like it would be very hard to communicate to the editor I love and I love working with, but just to figure out how to replicate the experience that I felt when you're like go from not wanting something to happen to realizing it's going to happen and then waiting for it to happen. In this case, somebody passing, which is like an absolutely definitely going to happen. There's no alternate, and it has this. In my experience, it's had a very strange experience. Like the way that time has moved has been very weird, in particular to it.
Hmm.
And so when I was writing the script, I was writing with that type of awkward pacing, especially in the beginning when people don't really know each other, haven't figured out the roles that they're going to play, who's going to be the cook, who's going to be the provider, who's going to fill in these different kind of places while we're stuck in an apartment together. So the pacing was very much written into the script, and what I was trying to do was write a script and ultimately make a movie that really didn't have transition moments like that. This whole thing is about it's one big transitional moment, right? Where
Hmm.
somebody's leaving, who's stepping away from his family, and there's a transition going on within his family. But to really avoid the kind of walking into a room, going in to grab this, grab a coffee, suddenly coming back in there. There's these big jumps that constantly are happening, at least in the first third or first half of the film, which is just kind of sometimes it feels like it's a run-on sentence, whether it's the
Right.
first scene, um, and then go straight into Carrie. So it just feels like there's a continuation of just like a certain type of like a train that's left the station. Um, and then other times there's like literal jumps, right, where somebody talks about, do you want to get a coffee? And then suddenly it cuts to them now fully dressed and holding a cup of coffee. And so that felt very really important. That was the basis of me just trying to write, actually, was just trying to figure out how do you do a film that really doesn't have a lot of transition moments. We just kind of go through one spot to the one spot, which is how it feels like, when you're just you're opening, you close your eyes and suddenly you're over here, then you open over there. And so the editing and the writing was one and the same. In fact, when I like finished the first draft of writing, I went straight into kind of going through trying to figure out how the pacing, because I was hearing a very specific pace on how the edits would happen. and then that would kind of go straight into the top of the camera. So another version of like the non-transitional moments that you're talking about, I try to like um restrain from like even seeing that Natasha, like Rachel's on the other side of the table in
Hmm.
the edit. Like, so there's constant like somebody else is in the room, but you don't really even realize that until
Right.
the edit reveals it itself, which felt like only something that you can do in film rather than
Yeah.
take it away from this theatrical, the play-like structure of the film as well.
Yeah, it did such a great job of making you feel sort of very, absent, or you're kind of curious, like, should I be listening in on the other half of this conversation, or should I be standing back, or should I be kind of just being a viewer? And I really enjoyed that. I think that's very unique in a lot of and today's films. It's not, everyone sort of wants you to have everything. They give you, a lot of context so that you're fully making sure that you're engaged in the story and obviously understanding everything before things happen, right? Like here, you're kind of slowly pulling us in and you're, kind of breadcrumbing us throughout the story because in real life, that's how we are too. We kind of hold things back. We don't share a lot of the things that we personally have in our hearts, especially if it's tough conversations, and it,
Yeah.
it really brings this raw energy to the characters. And I really enjoyed watching that, especially with, I mean, these phenomenal actors as well. They really, had their own personalities. And it's really kind of like I said, I'm going to bring up my second question is you're kind of like a fourth sibling, sitting in the room and you're kind of just there like should I interject in this conversation or it was very very powerful.
True. I think of it more like you're the father, that you're the
Interesting.
ear and the eyes of the father in that back room, that we may not be seeing him, but really getting an idea of him floating around these rooms and really very conscious. When it's your place, where you can just from the space, just from the sound of a footstep, somebody's in the kitchen, you have a visual image of what's going on.
Hmm.
So even though the father doesn't seem like he's conscious, I do always felt like knowing that he's breathing back there gave us the opportunity to shift and go into spaces and shift from point of view to point of view to point of view, which usually is not something that I've done. And it's like one of those things that you're kind of dissuaded from going, which is like, oh, whose story is this? Stay with that. You only can kind of follow down whatever that character sees. But
Right.
the fact that we can jump in and suddenly see how Christina's dealing with her family, even if she's not in the room, it's like they're very, very conscious of each other.
Yeah.
Um, Always conscious of each other. They know where you just can't avoid each other. And if they're not physically making up the same space, they're mentally making up each other's space. They're like, oh, she's in that room. I'm going to avoid going to that room.
Yeah, that I mean
And
that's again, yeah, it was a great explanation of that. And I think you're right. Yeah, that now that I think of it, you are kind of this overseer of the space and acting as like the father. I that didn't even think about that. Yeah, that's true. It really
well,
does.
he said that line at the end, which is like, you said this thing about how we watch movies, and it's like it's a little bit of a tip off. I had another line in there that I wound up cutting out where he talks about that he could actually juggle. Because you remember Christina says like, "Oh, he could juggle," and Rachel says, "No, he can't juggle." So there was another part in that whole monologue that he gives where he's like, "I actually could juggle." Like, so just to give this idea that he's actually been very, at least in his own mind, that there's been
Mhm.
some kind of service level that's been going
Yeah.
to him this entire time. But it's interesting, like you're totally right. Like it is absolutely like as an audience, we're getting little bits and pieces and we're figuring out the story. And at the same time, as sisters, as people, they're spilling out everything, especially like Katie and Christina. They're saying way more than what I think we naturally say to each other. And that was kind of like the push and pull of
Yeah. Yeah.
um situation of like, yeah, it exists on this planet, it exists in this ground, but there's also things that are certain like heightened that's beyond that kind of gives us something a little bit hopefully a bit different way of
Interpreting it.
experience.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, again, going back to the performances, they were so powerful and they were so well done in the way that you portrayed them in the edit and in the cut. What was like the directing process for that? Did you speak to each of them and kind of give them their own sort of direction, or like what was the kind of direction did you give these actors so that they kind of made that, character come to life in their own way?
Well, the one thing that I've learned, this is my seventh feature, and I've learned now that every actor works very, very differently, and to try
Mhm.
to figure out how what an actor is actually asking of you, because there's not just like one approach. So, and people are excited by different things. So, like Elizabeth Olsen, like we got to spend a bunch of days out just watching movies, talking quite a lot about Christina, where Christina is in her life, where and just kind of really finding our ways in our personal way of me saying like, oh, because neither one of us, like giving an example, like neither one of us really listened to the Grateful Dead, but we talked about people in our lives that really did and what we believe we found, what they found there, and who they were, and maybe what they were dealing with at the
Mhm.
time that they discovered this band and found this community. Um, and then for like Carrie Coon, it was very much like I don't have questions. It's all on the page. If questions come up, I'll ask you them. But otherwise, she's just going to like take every word that I wrote in the script, and this was actually all three of them. They all showed up on our first day. We had about 3 days of rehearsal. They all showed up on that first day, completely off book on
Wow.
the whole script. So they just had it all inside of them. So
Wow.
which was just kind of amazing. Unifying thing,
Right.
which it doesn't always happen. That everybody's coming in, they're all busy, they all have the other lives, but they all showed up
Mhm.
very, very, very prepared. And not only were they off book where they knew every line, but they also really had thought about each period and each comma. And like there was a very specific rhythm that when I would talk to Carrie and when I did talk to Natasha, I kept going back to this pacing thing that you're talking about. Not
Mhm.
only is it not transitional, but there's also a certain rhythm that I was writing each of these characters to have. And I felt like if I could just get them onto that rhythm, then everything else will become very, very clear. So when I was finally with a group of them, that really was more about me just closing my eyes and listening to them go through some of the scenes and
Mhm.
saying, oh, actually, I think it could be a bit faster here. Um, or this, just figuring out the tempo. And that that was like the thing that really carried us through once we began shooting. So there's always things that you go like, oh, let's close that gap, let's go, or let's just see. I can ask a question while we're shooting. Let's talk about scene one where Christina goes, it's been a while since I've seen you. I think it was Thanksgiving. Well, that's like a loaded thing because it's
Right.
like Rachel knows that it was things. Everybody knows it's not really a question. And it like, there's an implication there just in asking that question as if she doesn't know, where she's being kind of naive about something. They just haven't been there. The other
Right.
sisters haven't been there and they're kind of dancing around it. So that could be something where I could literally talk to Lizzie and talk to Natasha about how that's landing, whether they believe that line, how they're saying that line. That's something that we can kind of dig into. Um, Otherwise, I think that shooting this in order was just an absolute like really essential thing and just in terms of just staying on track and then shooting it on an actual location and dealing with, oh, when we're running out of light, we're running out of light,
Oh,
like that light is shit in the apartment. That's like it gives us very specific windows of how we're going to shoot this and when we're going to shoot this. um I came in with super, I came in with a kind of shot list that was based on this rhythm of how many shots I needed to get this kind of uh the pacing that I wanted. So if I knew that, I think one of the things that's always happened to me in previous films, because we shot this over 17 days, so
mhm.
it meant making sure that you don't fall into that trap of shooting one, like a single shot to cover the whole scene, which is
Right.
and like something that you really I've had to embrace a lot of times in independent films, which is like, it'd be great to just get this down, spend all day on a single shot and making sure all the elements work rather than run out of time trying to break this up into three shots.
Absolutely.
In this case, I really needed to break it up in specific shots because I needed them to be overlapping. I needed something to be kind of impossible. Like in the editing, it feels like one person speaks and then the other person answers, but the truth is that there's barely a frame sometimes between lines. It's like
Hmm.
impossible to, no matter how much I could tell them to close the gap, it's not humanly possible the way that they're speaking with each other in some of those scenes. So I knew, oh, this has to be single shot to single shot to single shot. I needed 3 shots to get this rhythm together. Um, so that would really dictate a lot of exactly during the rehearsals and how I was going to approach the acting, which is like, okay, this is yours, this is this, and how we're going to start this because of how the light's going to move. Like everything was this kind of semi-organic and semi really, really overly prepared. Um, like being very, very precise in something that had to also bend with the whims of time and light,
Wow.
especially.
No, that's
Yeah.
fascinating. I mean, that's really, really something, especially if you're an aspiring editor and director, kind of knowing that process really kind of puts, some insight on how to approach these kinds of scenes, right? Because, there's a lot of, I mean, most of the film is about the performance. It's a lot of the stories that they're telling. It's a lot of you trying to focus on what part or which character you want to, highlight. So you want to make sure you have the right pieces to make, the story come to life.
And
Um,
and it was a learning process too, because I shot that scene one, with them at the table. And the way that I had originally conceived in the writing and in the editing was stay on Katie for her entire monologue, stay on Lizzie for her entire
mm,
monologue, then reveal Rachel last. And then I realized, and I once I got the footage back from that first day, that no, that thing that I'm talking about of having people kind of be so pressed up against each other wasn't actually humanly possible. So
mhm,
then I started saying, oh, I need to actually intercut. I need to reveal Rachel earlier. I need to do that. So that kind of really kept me on track of being like, okay, if I want that, it's never going to happen in a single shot. It's never
right,
going to be, I have to, like, that's not going to be an organic thing that has to be forced upon.
right.
And that was the only time that I really, after that, I didn't do any editing while I was shooting. It was just that one scene I was really curious about. Okay,
Mhm.
this thing, could I do it in these long single shots? No, I can't. Okay, this is good to know. And then, kind of just go through the dailies as kind of enough for me to get a sense of where we are and how things are working out, but not get involved in any of the cutting.
Were there any performances that you had to leave at the cutting room floor that you might have, you were holding near and dear to you? Like, how do you approach that as an editor simultaneously as a director? Like I know obviously when you have two separate people
Yeah.
doing, how do you personally have that internal conflict or battle? Like, do you lean towards, oh, we got to cut it down, or are you as a director like, let's leave it in and see what happens until we really have to push it out, or what is that thought process like for you?
Yeah, it's the first one of like let's make sure we get the scene judgeable. Like
Mhm.
let's before I let go of something and just go, okay, let me do everything I can to fight to keep the scene in there
Mhm.
and understand why I felt like I needed a scene. And then go to the next thing, which is like, okay, even in this state, I'm realizing that it's not needed. And there's a tough one here because so I've always been, the way that I've been taught is, and I think most of us, if like a film can exist without a scene, then that scene probably doesn't is not needed, right? So like if you can just go from scene one to scene three and nobody knows that scene two is missing, that's like usually what they say is a very good indication that um, it's an unnecessary scene. And that only happened. There's only one scene that I lost in terms of just like cut out entirely. And that was a scene that I had where the three of them sit down and have a kind of dinner earlier on, like let's say 2/3 into the film. And it felt I did the best. I think the scene was great. I loved seeing the three of them together. And I cut it as into I think what was a dynamic scene, but ultimately just my instinct was it was way too early to see them connect in that way, and that we shouldn't really see the three of them together
Hmm.
until their father comes
Yeah.
out. So, um, and making sure that like right before the father comes out is the very first time that we have these overs between Natasha's character and Carrie's character. So it's the first time that we're actually seeing that, like, visually they're
Hmm.
finding each other and they're connecting in this way that we just haven't done throughout the whole film. So there's certain moments where we are doing that between, let's say, the morning after the big fight. I started doing overs between Lizzie and Carrie's characters at the window, and that's the first time where they're starting to see each other. And so
Hmm.
the like the biggest thing, the biggest rule for me is like don't get into coverage. Like I don't want this film to be coverage. I don't
Oh,
want to ever think about I just want it to be the right angles, but not just because I'm covering myself to make these choices later on. So everything was shot specifically for whatever reason. That's the one scene that wound up out. Otherwise, there'd be some times where I felt like I had overridden certain lines um, that, just were stronger, uh, just stronger with like a few less lines or whatever it was that felt like it was over-explained, but really not that much. I would say the biggest thing was that I did a only one work in progress scene
mhm.
viewing and invited about 20 friends. Some of them I knew really well, directors that I really love their work and trust, and other people that came through like producers, other people that we all trusted. So there was about 20 people, and that version of the father scene was about, I would say, about 4.5 minutes longer. And when the film ended, there was a very, very strong, respectable group of people that felt that the father scene should just be cut out entirely. And
Wow.
that goes back to that. Yeah, and their argument for a bunch of things was one was like you pull that scene out and that movie completely works. Like you would never notice, like you would never know it's gone. If you just go, they walk into the room, the three of them go down the hallway, they go into the room together, camera pushes in, and then a hard cut to the three of them sitting at the couch together and an empty chair. Like that works as a movie. And I
Hmm.
promise you, you'd watch that version, you would never have known that it went off on this thing. So that is, one of these cases where like I had to really, and then there was other people that felt really, really strongly that the father scene should be in, and it spoke to them in the kind of way that the writing of it, the shooting of it, what I wanted, it spoke like the way that it spoke to me.
Hmm.
And so that was a really confusing, upsetting night where I felt yeah, I just felt very, very confused. These were filmmakers who were a few filmmakers that were saying this that I love, and they make great movies. And then there were some other people that really were saying something very passionately and just saying how deeply it is speaking to them.
Hmm.
Um, and in that case, so my wife Diaz, who's we've been together for 24 years, and she's been my creative and producing partner through everything, like really from first draft to final everything, to final post. I was talking to her about like how much I needed this scene. Like I really did need this scene. I needed to exist. It kind of did something first off emotionally for me, but it also took the film in some place else that I really wanted to go, that I felt
Hmm.
like was unexpected in the way that I want movies to be unexpected, that it risked something that what it risked, like if it succeeded, it was such a bigger, higher game that the film without that scene was a very small film that basically drew these lines, made up these rules, and then followed the rules, which is not what I got into like that's not the films that have inspired me are the ones that generally are like that neat that have like coloring lines and then color within those lines. And so Diaz came in with me into the edit the next day and we just talked about it. And really she was like, well, look, basically both are right, like the version that you showed is not working and the things that are about it that are working are truly working, and you just need to make sure that every frame is is exactly fulfilling this thing. And so she stayed right by my side for that, and that was by far the scene that I just spent the most time figure out. Okay, so ultimately the scene is about 9.5 minutes, which makes sense because it was a 9-page scene. But just through the shooting of it, figure out how to, just the space. It just, it really was like one of these things where, you cut, you cut, you cut, and everything is just doesn't fit, just doesn't fit, doesn't fit, right? And then suddenly there's, oh, the cuts are fitting only one way, and it became the scene that it is. So the thing I walk away with is like they truly both these opposing groups were right. Without these people telling me to cut that scene out, it never would have become the scene that it is. And
Mhm.
without the people said that really responded to it, and obviously without Diaz's assistant, it would never have been the scene that it is. And that rule of if a movie can exist without a scene is just that. It's a rule. It's probably a really good rule. It's definitely probably right 99% of the time in this case. Like, but you should just see it as a rule that can be broken,
Right.
but it's not an
Well, the basically follow up for my next question is literally the monologue by the father was a definitely highlight favorite part for me in this film. So I'm glad that you kept it because it really did do something. Like you said, you're not basically saying following the rules. You're kind of confusing us for a little bit of what's really happening. And I, for a second was a little bit like, whoa, okay, he's getting up. He's not sick. He's fine. He looks healthy. I'm like, oh, interesting. And then you kind of just get caught in the wave of his monologue and you're like bought in, right? And then all of a sudden it snaps into this really kind of scary moment where he's really just unconscious and you're just like, oh, there we go. We're grounded back. Oh, wow. It was well done. I mean, it was really great in the way that you edited that because that's a lesson in editing. I mean, you can misdirect an audience pretty quickly if you have a compelling, story or a misdirect that like buys you in. So I'm glad that you kept that
so
because that was
well,
really,
yeah, I kept it for us. I kept it for this, for what you like that response. Like I felt like there if I felt that way, there'd be enough people, I hope, that'd be like
Mhm.
you. And
Right.
but the 3 stages that you brought up were that's exactly what it was. I sat down with the edit. Okay, so how to just get him up so that all right, we're oh shit, we just jumped the shark. Like
Yeah.
this is not like this doesn't make any sense. How
Hmm.
do we stay in that to the place of being like, okay, I guess I'm like I'm sitting in it for a while, and then suddenly you're kind of in it just just long enough that you just forget
Right.
that this is
Yep. Yeah.
seven. And then the moment you're there is the moment where we're bound. Like once we get to that space where we're just listening to the story about
Yep.
Bliss, and it's just like, oh, we're picturing Bliss and we're picturing what he's talking about. And then that's the moment where like we can't overstay its welcome. So in the original version, it really was took way too long for him to get up. I like
Hmm.
really tried to make it realistically that he was um kind of coming to. And it just like there's no realistic version of him coming to. So
Hmm.
there was this one take that I asked Jay. I was like, forget about this kind of slow reveal. Let's just go straight to like you tear this out and you stand up. And
Hmm.
luckily that was one of those safety things that sometimes you just in
Just
the back
do.
of your head you have to shoot. You just go like, just in case this is not going to what I need. Let's just go straight to what it is, which
That's
is
amazing.
hey, tear it off, get up, and start moving. And like right before we moved on to, and that was our master shot. And he's like, okay, and we just did that, and that was like essential. I don't even know what.
Amazing.
there's no going back to any of these sets. Like
Right.
there's that apartment was somebody's apartment. We completely redid it. We completely moved out. There's no like let's go back and just try to,
Yeah,
pick up.
absolutely. No, that's incredible. I mean, I literally was just about to ask, like, what was the, process in the editing room for that? Did you kind of have other iterations of how you approached that? But it sounds like you kind of already knew what you wanted when you watched the footage, and you kind of knew this sort of pattern of sequence of events that could happen. But that whole scene, I think, definitely stands out, and it's something I think that should be studied. It really does kind of, especially if you watch how you're breaking the rules and making it still, the movie that you want to tell, right? And the movie that it's supposed to be without sort of going overboard. So I think it did a great job kind of doing that. I really appreciated that as far
I
as like
appreciate
from an
it.
editing standpoint.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. It's like when we're editing, there's an intellectual answer and then there's an emotional answer.
Mhm.
And in this case, like intellectually, I could say certain things of like why I needed it, but emotionally it was something else. And like that has to trump.
Right.
It has to trump. And I like, like I'll go to these films, like we went to see there's been things that kind of Ace has been like presenting different films. They presented Slaughterhouse-Five, which I didn't know was made into a film, and it's Dee Dee Allen that edited it, and they're talking about it. And I didn't think the film was like that successful, but the editing was just like risky, like,
Hmm.
and that was something. Like you watch Reds or whatever, and you go like, oh my God, people really took some big risks in
Hmm.
editing. Which is it telling the story? Yes, absolutely. But it's telling the story in a very much more like an emotional way rather than in a like complete narrative of like, all right, now I understand what the layout is and I get that. And that's what I was trying to do, is just like
Amazing.
trying to take some of the risks in those ways that have always inspired me.
Yeah, no, I mean, it paid off very well. And again, like, I'm glad that you kept it because it's something that I think I personally will always share. Like, whenever I chat with my friends or chat with coworkers and, you know, what movie should I be watching for editing? And it's that alone kind of stands out and is a reason for someone to kind of watch for editing. So yeah, it's
That's
awesome. Let's switch a little bit gears here. So the siblings and their dynamic, were so well written and performed, so honestly and raw. What inspired you to make a film about siblinghood and sort of the pure conversations that we were seeing and portrayed in this film?
well, I think like many people, the siblings you just it's very like with marriages with love relationships there's a divorce that's like uh, you can truly go separate ways,
Hmm.
right? But with siblings there's just this thing that's being forced. I know that siblings also can completely go separate ways, but I have to imagine that even in those cases in the back of your mind that there's somebody floating around that's always somewhere in the back of somewhere in your mind, which is just you're connected to for
Hmm.
this that there's no choice in the matter, right? Which is very different than when you're like falling in love with somebody or with somebody. Like there was a choice, and then that choice changed. In this case, you're stuck. You're really stuck with each
Hmm.
other. And then they arise where you have to be, you truly are physically stuck with each other, and have to learn how to, at least for the moment, work things out. At least that's what Christina says. And that's an interesting dynamic for me. I'm always somebody that's like really drawn into telling stories in small places and being stuck in a place together. I think a lot of my films have taken place in one location. I'm always thinking about like production when I'm writing, which is like, what could I what could I do? What could I put together? What do I have? So, being in New York City, I know I wanted to shoot something here. I know I want to shoot in one of these apartments that I grew up going to quite a lot. I found that inspiring. Um, and I knew I had these actors. I knew these actors were people that I could write for, and hopefully I could at least give them the script, and hopefully they would sign on. But the sibling dynamic of it's just when I gone to it, it really stems from going to these apartments as a kid and just feeling like, wow, you could feel the history of a family in these walls that they just soaked in. Like there
Hmm.
is the dinners that have happened, the fights that have happened, the celebrations that have happened. Um, there's a containment
Hmm.
of ghosts, and that just I feel like that stuff keeps going on and on and on. It's in a loop in the way
Right.
that films are. So it gave me something a lot. The truth is that the writing of it was a lot of fun, and it had a lot to do with knowing that there's these very distinct personalities that can't get away from each other. They
Hmm.
really aren't going to go. We know exactly how this film is going to end. We know that he's going to die. Like that's an absolute setup in the beginning. Katie says it, the hospice nurse, everybody says this is going to happen. So we
Right.
know that there's some way that and I think as an audience, we're savvy enough to know that I'm not going to keep one of these sisters is not going to disappear two-thirds into the film.
Hmm.
So it gave me it's the forced proximity of the actual apartment and then the forced connection that these siblings have to have in this very moment that gave me a lot to explore and see,
Yeah,
no
it,
matter
it
if they want to get away, that they're not going to get away from each other.
it resonated because like a lot of the times we go into again like sibling relationships, either family, friends, cousins, whatever. It puts us sort of on the spotlight because that's sort of the same thought process that we have when we're approaching difficult conversations. You know, sometimes you just sit in silence. Sometimes you wait for the first, the person to say the first thing. You know, you can sort of like see the tension building, or you just feel the tension. And I think when I was watching this, you kind of get reminded of like, oh yeah, like it's kind of like those moments of like, I remember going through a conversation like that, or having that anxiety of like approaching, even just like bringing up something that you're so uncomfortable with, but you have to bring it up, you know? So there's a lot of
Yeah.
things that I think in this story that resonates, pretty well with how, we all kind of deal with tough relationships. And it's unfortunately that's life, right? We have to really walk the line and kind of just have to figure it out, whether that's
Yeah.
being passive aggressive or being the most outspoken, or there are just like this kind of dance of different things in your head where I don't know how to approach it. It might, and then you second guess yourself. So I really think that I love that part about the film too. It makes it so
And I've been each of those
real.
siblings, like they're playing archetypes, but I'm especially in the beginning, but I've been each of those archetypes.
Hmm.
That's how I've handled certain things in exactly how each of them do in different times of my life. And I think that was one of the things is like I understood each of them, and even though they could be exasperating, like from any angle on the other person, you could see how exasperating it would be to
Right.
have like this kind of peacekeeper sister, and then you have this sister that's just like this train, and then you have another sister that seems like she's not doing anything, that's
Yep.
just escaping, but ultimately there is I get it. I think that they feel really natural, including fighting. I think it's kind of neat that I think that fighting is as important as crying and holding each other, and it's a variation of that. And I think that it's neat that with siblings you can get into a fight, and then there's the next day
Hmm.
which is like it's not always like there's this thing of, well, maybe we're truly not meant for each other. That's not even part of the question. Like
Hmm.
you could be truly not meant for each other. Um, and you could be truly toxic to each other for that period, and you need space from each other. But at the end of the day, you know that you're forced together one way or
Hmm.
another, just
Yeah, that's a fascinating. Yeah, I just kind of spinning my wheels on that right now. Yeah, it's true. Like versus you kind of compare siblings to like a relationship. It's exactly that. You're
there's
forced, but
some
you're also together forever, regardless of what happens, which is so fascinating to think about. And I think it definitely touches on that a lot on this because you kind of realize that, even for so long, these three sisters have been either not reachable or incommunicative with each other, and then obviously something that brings them back together is their dad, and then they sort of catch up and sort of mend sort of their relationships with each other, and it's like, yeah, it's a
For that time, and it's like, who are
painful.
they gonna be? Like, I don't have the answer. I don't know. I do know that when because I don't know what they'll be like after their father is gone. I have fantasies about it,
Mhm.
and it's nothing that I can answer. I do love that at the end, like Rachel has taken this thing that her sister is forced her to do, step out and actually found comfort in something
Right.
that her sister, and that there's like, the line that she goes, I want every time you step out, you're not, it's not about dad, you're respecting me and my wishes. Like, I like that somehow there's still like her stepping out when she makes it her own choice, it's still out of her respect for her sister.
Right.
And I
Right.
do see them very, very similar in an odd way. It's just not too hard to imagine uh, Katie being like a Rachel at
Mhm.
some points in her life, either earlier or later on, and same and vice versa.
Right.
Rachel.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. I mean, the dynamic between them is it kind of it again, it sort of mirrors like our real relationships in one way or the other. And you can kind of think about, oh yeah, like I had a similar friendship or siblingship with that kind of same situation, and you're just kind of pointing now it's the story's pointing to you, and you kind of think about your own kind of values and your own kind of thoughts and how you would approach it. But yeah, so
Yeah.
I did want to share too. What I noticed is going back to sort of the filmmaking side of it. I only counted a handful of times when music was used as story device, and I really thought it was interesting and impressed me was like how the heart monitor sort of basically carried us in the story, and I think that is a something to kind of point out to filmmakers, young filmmakers in general, that you don't necessarily need to rely on a lot of music, a lot of I always say like visual effects or anything sort of flashy in order to get your point across, right? So, what was the significance of why kind of you used that heart monitor to kind of give us sort of an underlying score to help, emphasize sort of the beats of the story?
Well, two things, just to kind of tie those two together. So I wrote the script with these actors in mind, but I wrote with this composer in mind, Rodrigo Morante. And so I gave him the script and I asked him to start writing the music based on the script, which is something that I had seen him once before, which he did the opening song to Narcos, to that
Mm,
show. So that theme song to Narcos. And I happened to go by his house the day that he recorded that song, and he just had recorded on tape, which wound up becoming like this incredible
yeah, theme.
opening theme song. It's
Right.
an amazing, but he just played it to me on his tape that later on that day, and I was like, first off, I loved it, and secondly, that he had done it just based on because they hadn't started shooting the show yet, and
Hmm.
that he just did it based on the conversations he had with the director and reading whatever he had read. And so I was very inspired just thinking that Rodrigo could do that with this as well. I played him the Five Little Ducks song, and then I also played him the heartbeat monitor.
Hmm.
Um, so it was the songs that he wound up writing are all variations on based on the tempo of the
Oh.
heartbeat monitor and those five and the nursery rhyme.
Hmm.
So they're actually kind of reworking of the beats, like those that tempo, and also it's reworking of that nursery rhyme. So it's like those are almost the similar keys,
Right.
and like yeah, there's seven cues, and about four of them I would say were written just based completely on the script. So it's one side, it's like absolutely true, like it's sparse, but it was essential. It was really essential for me,
Hmm.
and especially that song in time that is like the only one that you're gonna hear somebody else's voice. It comes in straight at the end, kind of the moment that the end credits come on. It's really it. I always think of it as like more as a narrator,
Hmm.
uh, as a narration rather than an end song because it's somebody else's voice that's explicitly talking about the story that we just saw.
Hmm.
Um, and then yeah, this heartbeat monitor was one of these things that it was absolutely in the script, and then you're editing, and I'm realizing like I have to put the scene down, then add the heartbeat monitor, and just kind of understand like what that effect is. Now, that heartbeat monitor I would play while we were shooting as well, and that was one of the things that was really helpful whenever we were going through rehearsal, just to remind everybody, not only just the actors, but everybody, the crew, everybody that's there, that in this story that there's somebody back there. So even though that actor didn't show up until the days that we're shooting him at the very end, I could always go and play that heartbeat monitor from the bedroom, and it would just have this emotional effect
It
on all
does.
of us
Yeah.
because you really would feel. And so suddenly conversations that were happening with the sisters would come down. So because voices just naturally climb, and then suddenly you hear this and you're like, oh wait, there's another person, there's a fourth person back here, and we
Right.
just have to keep that in the back of our mind. And then doing that again in the edit room for me, myself, going, okay, this is actually going to play throughout the scene. And how does that have an effect on what the cutting rhythm is? And then the sound designer I wound up working with, like this was our first and big, like when we sat down to talk about working with each other, um, we really just talked about this heartbeat monitor and
Hmm.
what we could do with it and how could we play with it so that it's not like we're just laying down a single track from beginning to end, but how could we also play within a story-wise way, which is when when do the characters hear it? When does it become grating to the characters? When does it just become background? Do they no longer hear it because of whatever else is going on? And then when does it follow them around in ways that it just can't, right? So sometimes we hear finally like Rachel's out on the bench and we're still hearing the heartbeat monitor, or
Hmm.
we're in Christina's, it's way louder and it's actually kind of shifted in ways that's not totally right. And the thing about Gene Park is that he's a musician as well. So we were able to approach that completely thinking about it as like as a track, as a composer.
Right. Yeah.
So I would argue that yeah, we don't have a lot of songs, but there's a lot of music. It's almost like wall to wall music if you think of this tempo and the way that this heartbeat monitor shifts
Hmm.
throughout. It actually is shifting in tones, it's shifting in variations. It's going through three acts just like the story is itself. But even the time that it's taking, and then like leading up to this big moment at the end, so that when he does push the monitor over and it stops, we really feel that's the first time that we feel what absence is. We're like, oh
Right.
wow, we've been hearing this the whole time, and this is what silence is like.
Yeah, no, I mean at that again, I knew from kind of hearing it a couple of times it was a character that was definitely in the room, and you knew it played a huge effect on again their mood and the emotion and the way that they delivered their performance. I mean, it was very the sound in itself was kind of, a little bit anxiety ridden. You're like, is he gonna be okay now? Is this the scene where yeah, okay, all right, he's okay, he's all right. So there are moments in there that you're also listening one ear to their conversation, but one ear to the heart monitor, just so that, you're always kind of like aware and grounded to the conversation.
It's interesting. The other thing that was in the script is that there was like a breathing um device, which turned out like once we did research and stuff like that, that it turns out like you just wouldn't have that at home. So I dropped that uh completely because I really wanted like in the script I had this idea that you would hear this kind of breathing in the back room as well. Um the monitor I've been in a hospice experience where like that monitor was happening,
Mhm.
which has been odd because sometimes like there's been like people that are like very like hospice people are like, oh, that monitor sound wouldn't happen, and that's like just a narrative device. But the truth is actually like I've been in that, so I think if anything happened once, you're able to say that it's true. Like
Right.
it was true, and so I don't know how often it might be even, but even if it's like completely, very rarely, that's enough for you to like utilize in the story structure. But the breathing one, I really had to drop. Um, and that was just something that I had to talk about, at least with Gene, quite a bit, which was like, okay, I had this other tone that I thought would be happening as well. I wound up dropping it once we started shooting because found out that just wasn't plausible. But how could we also like use the echoes, or how could we use like where we are in the apartment so that the sound that it travels has an effect that also gives us an inhale and an exhale as well.
Hmm. No, yeah, that's also again bringing up personal experiences and influencing sort of your decisions. I think it's yeah, it's smart to kind of also take that into consideration as far as when you're filmmaking and you use what you know and use what your experiences have sort of taught you and kind of let it come to life in your films. I got a couple more questions because I know we're running out of time.
Of course.
What are some of the takeaways you learned after this experience on His Three Daughters? You know, what are some of the challenges that you had to overcome and what did you learn after working on this film?
I'm somebody that um, I can get full of the more that I think about something, I can get full of self-doubt about or just worry and fear. And in this case, I was just gonna go on instinct and try not to second guess that instinct. Um,
Mm,
and I felt like I had a direct line with what my gut was saying, and I really just tried to listen to my gut in a way that I never had done previously, with all the way across the board, with writing with these actors in mind, getting them the script, just feeling that they would respond. It was a completely new crew, just going with that, which is like I wanted to see what that felt like working in New York City, which I had done for a long time with a brand new crew, shooting on film, shooting at a certain budget, like all these things, um, setting up the productions, setting up how I wanted to cut by myself, which was terrible. Like
right.
it's scary, except like I wouldn't let myself be scared. I just like that's my instinct. I'm going to do that. I'm not going to second guess it. And all these things I'm trying to carry on with whatever else I do. Like I really was, it's like the more that you listen to yourself, the more you hear yourself.
Hmm.
Um, and that is something that I'm really trying to think about, which is like, okay, what feels right? Like the answer is there, and that generally has been like every time I've had red flags about things, those turned out to be super red flags. Why can't I listen
Hmm.
about on the other side of just like the positive things, the green flags are saying, go this way, go this way, go this way,
Right.
and just try to stay tuned to it.
Yeah, trusting your gut and believing in what your mind or your heart says, I think is definitely something that, we all should follow. It's an
But
interesting.
it's not how we're built as filmmakers. It's just like not,
Hmm.
it's
Second guess it
so
all the
many balls
time.
in the air. Yeah, I mean, and
Opinions
it's
hitting
and
you.
you have to. This is the other side is like, okay, we're shooting outside. It may rain. You really do need to think about it may rain. I can't be like, I just my gut is that the sky it's not going to rain today. It is like, oh, it's pretty good to come up with a plan in case it does rain.
Right.
But on the other side, like our last day of shooting was December 22nd. There was no additional day. Like
Hmm.
everybody flying out to Christmas. That was it. So there was also just going on and trusting and hoping.
I guess this might tie into this next last question. What advice can you give to a first-time film editor, first-time film director, first-time writer, to sort of, what are some practical steps that a newcomer can take in order to just kind of start his or her professional filmmaking career and sort of get to where you are, essentially?
Oh, well, there's a few things that I would say, which is one, um, like waiting is deadly. Like waiting is deadly. Like it
Interesting.
truly is. If
Mhm.
anything that can keep you pushing forward or moving forward, by all means, like and everything is preparation, everything is rehearsal, like everything that you could possibly do that doesn't cost money, like any step is essential, and like, and you have this time, so it's not like once I have money then I'm going to do all that stuff, because then suddenly you're not going to have time. Right now, before you have money, before you have equipment, you really have a special moment that you could spend as much as you need of like of something that's worth as much as money, which is like your focus of
Yep.
going, okay, let me think about how I'm going to approach, acting. How am I going to approach this or that, whatever, all the elements that you can possibly do on your own before you have to get somebody else that has uh, equipment and means. So, and that kind of leads into the second thing, which is all of us need, all of us need the same things. Like all of us need equipment and we need locations and we need money and we need actor, whatever it is. We all have like these very shared elements, but each of us have something that nobody else has. And like focus on that. Like to like what do I have as a let's say as a writer, what is the story that I can tell like that it's not going to get told if somebody, by anybody else? What is a location that I could potentially shoot at that no one really has access to? Like, is it my own apartment? Is it the deli across the street that I've been cool with and that will let me shoot in there? Is there like there's the practicality of what may be right within your grasp is something that nobody else can get. And I think that's like is absolutely essential. And that goes into the edit too, which is what do I have in front of me? What is the footage? Not what do I need? Oh, I know ultimately I may need that wide shot. I may ask to go back and ask, like, oh, could you do a variation of this? But here's what I do have. What can I utilize with this? Like, and I think that that's the thing that because like a lot of these things that we're talking about, like the wrestling with the scene with the father scene, like in the end of the day, when I first got into it, I was like, oh man, if I would have gotten that, I could have done that, I could have done this, I could have done that. But it was actually looking and listening to the footage and realizing, well, this is what I have. How do I make this work?
Right.
You and that's the biggest thing that I would try to like pass on, which is like, what is yours?
Right. That's amazing advice. I mean, even the waiting part, I think, is one I actually haven't heard someone say yet. Is sort of if you keep waiting, it's just gonna delay that next step, right? And you keep waiting and waiting, and soon enough, you'll run out of time.
The phone
That's
call never comes, the email never comes, like
Yep.
no one, I've never seen it. I've never known of anybody that got like that. Oh, I heard you're a filmmaker. I'd love to make you feel like that's not gonna like and
Yeah.
it's definitely never in my life.
Well, thank you so much for spending time with me. I'm sure my audience is going to get a lot out of this interview. You really went into depth on your process and your teachings and your experiences. So I really appreciate, obviously, you have a lot on your plate as far as time and your schedule. So really, thank you so much for spending time with me today. Azazel Jacobs, his film is on Netflix, his three daughters, and make sure you guys watch it, and we will hopefully, see you this Oscar season. Really great job.